We'll be starting shortly.
When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. There the old man's waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Now the riverbank will make a mighty good road. The dead trees will show you the way. Left foot, peg foot, traveling on. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Now the river ends between two hills. Follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. When the great big river meets the little river, follow the drinking gourd. For the old man's waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd.
Well, I'd like to welcome you to Maywood Library's program tonight on the Underground Railroad, more specifically the Underground Railroad and how it was handled in New Jersey and surrounding areas. What you heard as you first came in, the music was a song called Follow the Drinking Gourd, which was first published in 1928. It was supposedly used by the Underground Railroad operatives to encode escape instructions and a map. If you understand what a drinking gourd is, it's a hollowed out gourd that was used back in the 18th and the 19th centuries for water. But this drinking gourd was really supposedly used to have maps and encoded instructions, and also used as a code name for the Big Dipper Formation, which is the North Star. So as escaped slaves moved from the South, they followed the North Star. It's more of a folklore song than a historical song, because in I found some of the lyrics, especially you heard for the old man is waiting to carry you to freedom, couldn't have been written during slavery because it was written about 1940 by a Lee Hayes. But the song is connected with the Underground Railroad. What we're going to do tonight is look at the Underground Railroad, both generally as it applied to its entirety, and also look at some of the spots in New Jersey, North, Central, and South, where the Southern had more points for the Underground Railroad. Try to give you an understanding of what the Underground Railroad was. We're going to, as usual with all these programs, mix in some video and audio to go with it. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding. In researching this, I got a much better understanding. We'll talk about some of the key players that were in the Underground Railroad, some not as famous as others. But I think with that, we are going to want to get started. So, give a second. All right, so what was the Underground Railroad? Well, it wasn't a physical railroad. It was a network of people, both the African Americans as well as whites, that gave shelter, that helped enslaved people from the South who had escaped make it to freedom, whether freedom in many different parts, and we'll discuss that. It had different routes. It had different entrance and exits points. And as this slide says, the exact dates of its existence are not known, but it didn't operate just right before the Civil War. It was from the late 18th century, excuse me, so late 1700s to the Civil War, at which point the efforts continued, but that was to undermine the Confederacy in a less secretive manner. And on the left-hand side of the screen right here, this is Harriet Tubman, who was a escaped slave and probably one of the most famous people regarding the Underground Railroad, who helped people escape.
Dear Tim and Moby, what can you tell me about the Underground Railroad? Your friend, Bo. Hey, Bo. The Underground Railroad wasn't a subway or anything like that. It was a network of escape routes and hideouts set up during the 19th century. African Americans used it to flee the slave-holding states of the South. The underground part meant that they traveled in complete secrecy. And railroad came from the code language they used in communications, like conductors for the people who helped runaways escape, passengers or baggage for those who were fleeing slavery, and stations for the homes and other places where they'd hide. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children escaped to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Most settled in northern states and Canada, while some went west or farther south. Life wasn't easy in a lot of these places. Runaways faced racism just about everywhere they settled, but they had gained their freedom. Some joined groups of abolitionists, people committed to ending slavery. The Quakers, a Christian organization, were some of the earliest abolitionists. One of their central beliefs is that all people are equal. I know, but back in the 1800s, that was a pretty radical idea. It took a broad range of people to get support for the abolitionist cause. Like Frederick Douglass, who'd escaped slavery as a young man. He wrote and spoke with passion about the cruelty of owning human beings. Sojourner Truth, once enslaved herself, was another fearless crusader. When someone threatened to burn down a hall where she was scheduled to talk, she replied, "Then I will speak upon the ashes." White abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Henry Ward Beecher were equally passionate. And religious groups besides the Quakers got involved too. All of these people worked tirelessly to end slavery and help runaways build new lives. As the abolitionist movement grew, the Underground Railroad picked up steam. Routes expanded, and new ones opened up heading to Mexico and the Caribbean. The path to freedom often meant going long distances by foot, carrying everything you owned. But people also had to stow away on boats, wagons, and trains. Whatever it took to escape a life of slavery. One man, Henry Box Brown, even shipped himself from Virginia to Pennsylvania. An abolitionist shop owner helped him hide in a wooden cargo box. He spent over a day inside before it was safely reopened in Philadelphia. The journey wasn't easy for anyone and could stretch over 1,000 miles. Passengers avoided main roads and traveled mostly at night. They often had to duck into swamps or forests to avoid being seen and captured. Those who helped them were also at risk. You could be thrown in jail for giving runaways food or shelter. Despite the danger, some folks took on even bigger roles in the Underground Railroad. They personally guided passengers between stations, taking them from one stop to the next. These were the railroad's conductors. The majority were African Americans already living freely in the North. Harriet Tubman is the most well-known. She was born into slavery in Maryland, but escaped to Pennsylvania when she was a young woman. Tubman helped more than 100 people make it north. Another important conductor was William Still. He kept detailed records of the nearly 650 people he helped save. Still used these stories to publish a book about their experiences. That's one reason we know so much about the Underground Railroad. No, slave owners weren't too happy about losing the people they viewed as their property. They resented Northerners for interfering in their business, and were especially outraged at states that protected runaways. Federal regulations said that any escapees had to be returned. In the eyes of the law, they were like stolen property. But several states passed laws making it illegal to arrest them. Other states gave runaways the right to jury trials and free legal help. Often, juries would refuse to convict, and the men and women would go free. So Southerners pushed the federal government to pass the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Anyone in law enforcement who didn't arrest a runaway would have to pay a big fine, and people who sheltered or helped them could be imprisoned. The law infuriated Northern abolitionists. Most continued to help African Americans make it to Canada, even though they now faced serious consequences. The slavery issue ripped the country apart, dividing North and South. In Kansas, the dispute spilled over into armed combat, and in 1861, the conflict finally exploded into the Civil War. You can learn more about that in our Civil War Causes movie. Hey, here's our train. You may want to stand aside. Because, that.
So that'll give you a little bit of background on the start of the Underground Railroad. We're going to go a little deeper into it. They were talking about the fugitive slave law that was enacted by the federal government, but much like throughout United States history, the states were allowed to have their own laws that superseded some of the federal laws. So the Underground Railroad was allowed to progress. Now, according to one of the abolitionists I found when I was reading, a man named John Rankin, who's a Presbyterian minister, they called it the Underground Railroad because the people who took the passage, the slaves who had took passage on it, disappeared from public view as if they had gone into the underground. And after the fugitive slaves entered the depot of the railroad station on the road, no trace of them could ever be found. So the Underground Railroad name stuck, and that's probably one of the better explanations of why it was called that. Now here's a map showing the Underground Railroad's routes, the free states, the slave states, and it doesn't really show Kentucky, not Kentucky, Kansas, which is over here, I believe up in this area. But you'll notice that most of the routes, and this is the routes that expanded, obviously started in the South or in the slave states, and they moved to the North. Some were interconnecting, like if you go from South to North Carolina, you'll hit one of the main lines, these going up to Canada. They could go out to sea from coastal states and make it to Northern, then hook up and again go to Canada. But just like the video clip showed, they did go down into Mexico. They did eventually go into the Caribbean, and some of them stopped in free states, which would make up the northern states during the Civil War. and people would settle there. Now, there's a timeline for the Underground Railroad. And again, they mentioned the Quakers, which we call the Quiet Revolutionaries. And if you look at the timeline of events that pertain to the Underground Railroad, you got to move back, a few hundred years before it even started. You got to go back to about 1501. That is when I found that African slaves were being introduced into the New World. And that's the New World. That's not just the colonies, but the New World, anything that Columbus or whomever found on our end. About 1619, slaves started to show up in the Virginia colonies. And in 1700, the first anti-slavery publication, it was called The Selling of Joseph by someone called Samuel Sewell, Sewell, made its appearance. Excuse me. In 1775, you had the Abolitionist Society founded, and its first president was Benjamin Franklin. And as they talked about in the video, the Fugitive Slave Act came about in 1793, but there was more after that. You had, in 1808, the United States, the federal government banned the slave trade, but it still continued in the southern states. In 1820, you had something called the Missouri Compromise, if you're familiar with that. Missouri became a state. It came into the Union, but as a slave state. Maine came in as a free state. So slavery was then forbidden in any subsequent territories north of a certain latitude. I won't get into the specifics of that. And as time went on, there were more and more anti-slavery groups. In the 1830s, of all places, England abolished slavery, and that included their colonies in Jamaica, Barbados, and other West Indian territories. Thus, when the Underground Railroad started, as I said, escaped slaves would make their way into those areas for their freedom. In 1837, so we're still talking a good, 25 years before the Civil War, they had the first anti-slavery convention of American women, which was held in New York. And there were lots of things going on. Frederick Douglass really comes upon the scene in 1845. He published his narrative life of Frederick Douglass and his time as a slave. Harriet Tubman escaped from her slavery in Maryland and went to Canada in 1849. She did come back to the States. And there's a lot of stuff that was going on, but slavery continued, the Underground Railroad continued. And there was a decision, you probably have heard about it, in 1857 called the Dred Scott decision. That's where the Supreme Court, by 7-2, decided that African Americans couldn't be citizens and that Congress has no authority to outlaw slavery in any territory. And 7-2, that's quite a vote. John Brown came on the scene in 1859 with Harper's Ferry. And then we had Lincoln, United States, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which decreed all slaves in the rebel territories are free, on 1863, January 1st. And slavery was abolished in the 13th Amendment in 1865. So from its beginnings in 1501 to another over 300 years, there's a lot that happened. As I said before, there are some people that people have heard of, but there are some that you may not have heard of. We have Harriet Tubman over here, which everybody seems to know about, and Frederick Douglass right here. But I found two other ones that I thought were kind of interesting, so I included them today. This is Harriet Jacobs. She's also known as Harriet Ann Jacobs, and she was born in 1813 in North Carolina, and she died in 1897 in Washington, D.C. She was born into slavery, but she was taught to read at an early age, which was not common at that time. She was orphaned as a young child, formed a bond with her maternal grandmother, Molly Hornblower, who had been freed from slavery. So while she was in a teen, she became involved with a neighbor, a young white lawyer, and she had two children. When she refused to be her owner's concubine, she was sent to work in a nearby plantation. And they tried to sell her children, who were bought by their father and later sent to the North. She escaped and spent 7 years hiding. She escaped in 1842, worked as a nursemaid in New York City, eventually moved to Rochester, and she worked in the anti-slavery reading rooms above Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. She became a lecturer. She had a lifelong friendship with the Quakers and their reformers. She self-published a book in 1861 called Incidents of a Life of a Slave Girl. Probably they could consider it the most comprehensive slave narrative written by a woman. And she discussed everything when done. She did not shy away from anguish felt by slave mothers who children were taken away from, or sexual abuse of slaves. She wrote down everything. And these two people, down in the corner here, this is William and Ellen Craft. Now, William and Ellen Craft, we're not going to talk about right now. We're going to talk about them at the end, because what they did, their story is very interesting, and I think it's a good way to end towards it. So here are, let's move from general, let's move to the New Jersey. This is more the southern and central routes of the Underground Railroad in Jersey about 1860. As you see, people were coming in to South Jersey. So you're talking, here's Swedesboro, here's Philly, Atlantic City would be in this area here. They also would be coming from Pennsylvania, coming up other ways. So they're coming up from the other states, going to Ohio, coming in Pennsylvania. Their grand goal was to make it up north, either get a ship to get out to Canada or keep going up to north. And I'll show you some of the sites in the north that I found at that time that were used. As I said, they traveled mostly at night. They traveled along the coast. They really couldn't travel like daily railroads or stuff like that. They would stick out. What I found out, what I researched, is that networks in New Jersey, the Underground Railroad routes and the lines, as they call them, were determined by several factors. Not all, but variables. Were there free Blacks living in an area? Because that would be a good way to pass through. Was there an abolition society in the area, or an African Methodist Episcopal congregation, an AME, in the area, or a what they called colored Presbyterian churches, or a Quaker meeting, or a Methodist congregation, or a Presbyterian congregation, because that would be a good way to travel, because all those people were either working to help them on the Underground Rail or were sympathetic to them and to their cause. And what the southern part of it was down here, as I was saying. The central part really ran from Swedesboro. So Swedesboro is about, if you took the Turnpike today, you would get off about exit 3 or so, which is, if you went this way, it would be towards Glassboro. It ran from Swedesboro to Barnegat over the Atlantic Ocean. So it's, across here. It included most of Burlington, Camden, and Ocean counties, and a bit of Gloucester County also. And then the northern section started really up here in Bordentown, went to the Atlantic coast again, and then you're going to see that it covered everything up here. It went through, even through Bergen County. I found some spots, went up into Sussex, and then went into New York State, and eventually into Canada, not Kanaka, but Canada. And here's a little more in detail of full routes, so you can see outcroppings of it. So if you're starting down here in Greenwich, you could take the line all the way into New York City. It's not showing the ones that went up to here through Newfoundland and West Milford and Stockholm. Boonton was a big area, Jersey City, but you would, based on who your conductor was, be traveling at night, be traveling through darkness, and you're not traveling on most of the time on the main roads. You'd be going through terrain like this. This is something called Sourlands. It's in, excuse me, as I lose my voice here, but Sourlands was really around the Hillsborough area. We don't have big mountains here in Jersey. We do have hills. We do have, being a hiker, I know these things. This one is called Sourlands. This is typical. The mountains are rocky, they're wooded, they're good, not just for traveling, not to be seen, but also as a hiding place. If you had to hide, this made it perfect. And that's where a lot of the Underground Railroad was passing through. You did not spend a night unless you were, for some reason, usually spent night in one of the stations, one of the people's houses. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview here of the New Jersey Underground Railroad, and then we'll be back to look at some of the places I have found both in North, Central, and South Jersey.
The quest for freedom prompted an estimated 100,000 fugitive black slaves to make the dangerous journey along the Underground Railroad during the 1800s. This map shows the various routes they traveled. Among the key stops in New Jersey were Salem, Camden, Burlington, and Jersey City.
We were the last leg of the journey from the south. You crossed the Hudson River into New York. Some stayed in New York, some continued up to Canada.
Abolitionists like Harriet Tubman and William Still helped hundreds of fugitive slaves navigate their way through New Jersey. This PBS documentary gives a dramatic account of Still's life.
Heroism and desperate struggle that many of our people had to endure should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations.
Slaves that made it to Jersey City found help from local abolitionists.
One of the probably best known abolitionists here in Jersey City was David Holden. He had a home built on Clifton Place in 1857. Mr. Holden was an amateur astronomer as well as an abolitionist, and he had an observatory on top of his home, and he would hide slaves in his house.
But not all fugitive slaves were welcomed here. Some Jersey City residents opposed the abolitionist movement. In fact, one sympathizer was stoned right here at this park, and there were prominent citizens here who were slave owners.
The Newkirk family is a prominent, very early Dutch family in Jersey City, and when I saw his estate after he died, the listing of his holdings, I was like, oh my goodness, he had one Negro male worth $200, one woman, Negro woman worth $100, and one boy Negro worth $50.
There were also slave traders in Jersey City.
Captain Thomas Brown, he had Retirement Hall, which was near the water, and he was a slave dealer going back to the 1600s, and became a very rich man through his slave trade.
New Jersey was the last of the northern states to abolish slavery in 1846, but this didn't mean total emancipation because slaves were relegated to the status of apprentices for life.
By the census of 1860, even though by that time slavery had been outlawed in New Jersey, there were still 18 slaves in New Jersey.
Jersey City Library has a vast array of books and documents that help tell this compelling dark chapter in American history, and there are events scheduled throughout Black History Month to help bring this history to life. For NJ Today, I'm Desiree Taylor in Jersey City.
So the librarian there was talking about Jersey City, and I figured we'll start with there. And she was talking about two gentlemen, David Holden and his cousin, David, excuse me, I like to lose my voice again, David Holden. And this was his house. This is the house they showed you in the video. It's a little overgrown now, but it is a historical place. He was a colonel and an amateur astronomer. He was one of the founders of the Universalist Church in Jersey City. And he served as president of the Board of Education. He was an alderman under John Hilton, who was the first mayor of the city first mayor of the city. And just a general fact, between about the 1820s and the 1860s, about 141,000 slaves of African descent escaped bondage through the Underground Railroad. Jersey City was used because a lot of routes converged there, and people came from, Camden or Burlington counties. As I said, then this house here was across the street, or is still across the street from the Jersey Medical Center in Jersey Center. Others came to this area using the Morris Canal, and if you drive along the area where the Morris Canal, there are a lot of plaques. And there, abolitionists probably would hide people in brick tunnels along the waterfront, or they would help them arrange to get onto ferries or coal barges that go up the Erie Canal, up the Hudson River, get to New England, get to upstate New York, and then eventually to Canada. The Holden House, which is at 79 Clifton Place, if you'd like to visit it, it's the only remnant left in Jersey City of the Underground Railroad. This is the cemetery and stone of the Holden family in Jersey City. Now, I started up north, but we're going to go back down south. This is, as I said, there were a lot of African AME churches and things like that, and you had more of them because they were closer in the south, so more escaped slaves would start their journey. This is the Bethel African Church, as I said, which is in Greenwich in Cumberland County. It was one of the oldest Black churches in New Jersey, going back to the early 1800s. it's really it was built in a swamp area, so it provided good cover for fugitive slaves who came out of Delaware or Maryland and came across Delaware Bay. And there's a lot of evidence that the Underground Railroad had passed through that. There's a lot of oral tradition talking about people who passed through there. And there were books written. And from what I could read and what I found, the slaves were hidden both on the property of this church and Black churches around there. So this is down south. This is the Goodwin sisters' house. Now the Goodwin sisters' house, again, is down south. It's in Salem, New Jersey. This was built in 1821. These houses are still standing today. And this is probably the state's best documented Underground Railroad station. Came probably a station around 1838. They were said it was operated by Abigail Goodwin and her sister Elizabeth, who were both abolitionists, and they were Quakers. And one of the source of documentation that proves this was an Underground Railroad stop is correspondence between Abigail and William Still, who was mentioned earlier in this program. He was a famed Underground Railroad operative out of Philadelphia. And another source of documentation, there was a diary kept by the nephew of the Goodwin sisters. Now, Abigail Goodwin herself, this is a drawing that I found of her. She was born in Salem, and she was a staunch, as I said, abolitionist. She was a birthright Quaker, and had grandparents, excuse me, both sides of her mother's and father's family, both sides of her grandparents were Quakers, so she went back to it. She was involved in many activities for the assistance of people who need. She was a founding member of the Female Benevolent Society of Salem, which was an organization dedicated to the relief of the infirmed, the aged, the unemployed, and those who were widowed with small children. She was active in that Female Anti-Slavery Society, which I mentioned earlier. And she's probably best, I found that she's remembered for her work with the Underground Railroad, probably the foremost female member of the New Jersey Underground Railroad. And she was friends with William Still and Harriet Tubman. And she documented everything from the 1840s to the start of the Civil War. And you, as I said, you can find that in her correspondence with these people. In Swedesboro, I mentioned where Swedesboro was, but this is the Mount Zion African American Methodist Episcopal Church. As you can see, most of these churches were not very big. This section, this was the original. This was added on afterward. It was built in about 1830, 1833, 34. And there's a lot of evidence that the Underground Railroad passed through there. It's been documented. There's oral, there's written history on it. And some of the residents who lived in Swedesboro and part of this congregation were actually runaway slaves. So obviously they settled here. They welcomed other escaped slaves either into the community or helping them through to get to other places. It's probably the primary documentation that I found on this were a couple of Underground Railroad operatives, Pompey Lewis and Jubilee Sharper, who left a lot of written documentation. This is the Peter Mott House in Camden County. Probably one of the most famous in Jersey. Built around 1844. This is a good sized house for them. And this is what they call an extremely precious Underground Railroad site, because it's not only one of the few Underground Railroad stations that was owned and operated by an African American. It's probably the only site in the nation, probably, they said. I couldn't track it down. A Black-owned and operated Underground Railroad station in an all-Black town. Excuse me. Peter Mott, who was born in around 1807, lived to 1888, was a free Black farmer. Possibly, they can't have all the documentation, but he was possibly a fugitive slave from Delaware. And he also served as a pastor of an AME church. Let me just catch up for a second. I don't want to lose my notes. I'm going to give you a little video on Peter Mott's house.
Hearing the civil rights movement is important, but there was history before that.
The Peter Mott House here in Lawnside, New Jersey is the oldest known house to serve as a station during the Underground Railroad during the mid-1800s.
Peter Mott was a farmer, a laborer, and a Sunday school superintendent. And he was Sunday school superintendent of Mount Pisgah, which is about 4 or 5 blocks up on the hill here. And being a man who had religious values, he thought it was not robbery to hide people who needed a safe haven.
You would come in through here, pretty much.
You would come in from one of these doors
And hide.
down
here.
there. Yes. Peter would go to Haddonfield with his horse and wagon with a false bottom, with vegetables and hay, and pick up the person or persons, and then secret them here in the house, in the basement, or like I said, they could have just blended in with the people of color who were already here. People can come in and get the feel of what it really was like, and we can tell the story. The Lawnside Historical Society can tell the story about Peter Mott and his wife hiding or secreting people here in this house in Lawnside, New Jersey. I think young people need to know where we came from, how we got there, the struggle, the many lives that were lost, the many broken hearts, the many broken dreams, the many times you thought you would see your loved ones again back on a plantation and they weren't there. You don't know what happened to them.
We'll stop for a second. So it's a place that still can be visited if you go down south. As all these other sites, there are a lot of documentation on the internet put out by the state, put out by private organizations that list these sites where you can go to, sites of housing, cemeteries, and other historical buildings. And doing a search on the internet, if you have time and you would like to visit them, you can. Now we're going to move north a little more. We're going to go up around Trenton, between Trenton and Philly, and then we're going to move up to Patterson next. And then we're going to stay in northern New Jersey. But I wanted to show you 2 different videos. It's actually one video that I cut up into 2. The first one is about a site called Timbuktu. Now, everybody thinks, oh, Timbuktu. Yeah, I remember when as a kid, my parents said, oh, we're going to Timbuktu. It's in Africa. Oh, no, Timbuktu is actually West Hampton, New Jersey in Burlington County. And it was a town that was founded by free Blacks and former slaves about 1825. And I'm going to show you the video that's going to show you some of the stuff in Timbuktu. But a little side note here, in 1860, there was something called the Battle of Pine Swamp, and it was reported in a local newspaper. And to just preface the rest of this, people used to just come from the South, to try to catch runaway slaves and bring them back. Well, in 1860, the armed residents in Timbuktu prevented the capture of a gentleman named Perry Simmons, who escaped from slavery, and he was living in Timbuktu. And there was a person trying to catch him and return him. His name was George Alberti, and they called the Battle of Pine Swamp because they, by an armed, won't call it insurrection, but they protected him and didn't allow him to be taken back. So here's a little something on Timbuktu. As a person who's very much into history, I'll be visiting there. I have to find some time in the coming months to go down there because it looks like some place that is steeped in history and also humanity. And the second part of the video that was actually hooked with this one is much closer. This is in Paterson. There is a Underground Railroad memorial that's only probably about 7, 8 years old in Paterson. But here's that section, and I'll discuss it a little more. And this monument in this little park is on 125 Broadway in Paterson. As I said, let's just, whoops. This is a couple of markers about it, about the Huntoon Van Rensselaer station of the Underground Railroad. As I said, it was the monument was dedicated in 2014. And if you go to 125 Broadway, you'll see it's not a big park, but it's impressive. And the interesting, whoops, as I went too far, but we'll come back. We'll come back. We'll come back. Let's go share that screen again. And I make a mistake at least once a day on this. Okay, slideshow file here. Okay. Here we go. This is Huntoon's Corner. There's the station. The interesting piece I found here was the two men, Josiah Huntoon was a white man, and William Van Rensselaer was a former black slave. And the two of them manned the secret, excuse me, safe houses and the routes that helped slaves on the Underground Railroad move north. Huntoon was a spice merchant. Van Rensselaer was an engineer. And they moved the people from Patterson. They went north, and we're going to move up further north as we go, and passed them through. One gentleman, Mr. Huntoon, lived until 1891, and was at one time a Passaic County freeholder. Mr. Van Rensselaer lived until 1904. And he, as I said, he was an engineer, but as you'll notice on the stone over here, he was the first known African-American engineer in the area. And as I said, the monument went up before the park. The monument went up in 1999, and the park was in 2014. And if we go a little over to the west, and I'm going to screw up this name, but this is the Boisabin Manor or Boisabin Manor. It's in Morristown, Madison area. This, with the Greek columns there, the building was built in 1790. It's on the register, National Register of Historic Places. It got that naming in 1976, bicentennial. And it's, if you want to visit it, it's on Treadwell Avenue in Morristown. And it was sold in 1853 to Alfred Treadwell. I guess they named the street after him, who was an avid abolitionist and a supporter of the Underground Railroad. And one of the really interesting things I found was, I'm not sure which one, but you've got these four columns out front here. One of the columns is hollow, and it had stairways inside that led to a cave and into the back of the estate. And it took them where the slaves could sleep. So no one knew that the columns were hollowed out, and they could go and spend the night there. There were other places. I mean, one thing I found about this place, that some people say Madison, some places say Morristown. I don't know if boundaries have changed over the years, but it's definitely on Treadwell Avenue in Morristown. The original owner, Lusty Boisabin, he was Vincent Boisabin. He was a nobleman and an officer of the bodyguard of Louis XVI of France, and then it was sold to Treadwell. And they also had a barn out back where people could stay. And during the Civil War days, they say that the tunnel also was equipped with hollowed alcoves and for sleeping, and had a wiring or a telegraph communication system. That would be an interesting, I don't think you can get in there now, but it would have been an interesting place to visit. I'd like to get down into it. So now, once I stop screwing up these things here, let's go back here. Let's go back here. I'm going to show you the next one. There's a few more. We're going to move up to Boonton. If you've been to Boonton, It's not far from us. You can go down Route 287, Boonton. And we have the Powerville Hotel in Boonton and Charles Fern Hopkins. Now, the Powerville Hotel, excuse me, was owned by the father of Charles Fern Hopkins. It's still there. It's not a hotel any longer. It's located on North Main Street. As I said, it was his father's street. And when Charles Fern Hopkins and his family is a descendant of the signers of the Mayflower Compact back in 1620 and the Declaration of Independence. And he, as a boy, assisted helping slaves from other places to get to the Powerville Hotel and then moved on. Now, Charles Fern Hopkins was in the Civil War. He was captured twice. He survived the Civil War. He was in 2 prisoner of war camps, Florence Prison and the infamous Andersonville, but he lived to come back home. In 1892, he got the Congressional Medal of Honor for the Civil War. So he led a very, very full life, but he was heavily involved prior to the Civil War with the Underground Railroad. The hotel was used as a stopping grounds, even though it was a functional hotel. Now, close by us, in the township of Washington Township, or what we call Washington Township, there is a house, the Nicholas Zabrinsky House, also known as Seven Chimneys House. It's at 25 at Chimney Ridge Court in Washington Township. It has been reported and documented that it harbored many slave runaways. It's one of the oldest buildings in Washington Township. And it, like the Boysenman Manor, it contains a secret room hidden in the upstairs and kitchen passages, which at that time led into the wetlands. Prior to the Civil War, it was owned by Alfred Van Emberg, which is a prominent name in Bergen County, and his wife, Annette Zabriskie. And the home was open to what I read to as many as 6 escaped slaves at a time. And it's according to the National Registry of Historic Places. So it's another one. And if you're interested to go see it, not go on the property, but here is a little map. So if you're familiar with anything here, here's Pascack Road. Pascack Road, if you went onto Farview Avenue in Rochelle Park, followed it north, you will eventually turn into Pascack Road. When you get to the corner here of Ridgewood Road and Pascack Road, here's Bakari Grill, which is a restaurant. If you made the right-hand turn, there is a garden center here. And then made your next left, you could come around. It's a dead end cul-de-sac, and you could see the house for yourself right there. So we started in the south. We've been moving to central New Jersey, through northern New Jersey, but it kept going north. I mean, it went up into, went through New York State and into Canada. I'm sure New England also, but you would go into Orange County, Rockland County. There are houses there too. This is the United Methodist Church of Newfoundland, which is really in West Milford, I would think. It's no longer a church. It is now a business. or was a business, the last I could find, called the Clip Shop, which is a dog grooming business. The ministry itself dates back to before the Civil War. And the locals and what I've read considered this one of the last stops in the Underground Railroad in New Jersey before you crossed the border into New York State. At the time it was active, the next door residents reportedly had underground passages. This seems to be something that you find in many of the places, but it had underground passages that led to a nearby cemetery. It led to the barn out back, so people could escape if they had to, but they also was able to have quarters to sleep. And unfortunately, a lot of the site itself, which held the barn, was filled in years later when a wastewater system for the area was built there. But the cemetery, still there. This is the cemetery that's there. Not the greatest picture, but you can tell from the markers that they are not just new markers. So the last slide I'm going to show you is we talked about earlier when I showed you pictures of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. I also showed you William and Ellen Craft. And this is William and Ellen Craft, both dressed as men. Now, Ellen and William were escaped slave fugitives, and they were born and enslaved in Macon, Georgia. They escaped to the north in 1848, and they traveled by train and steamboat, which was not common, and they got into Philadelphia on Christmas Day in 1848. How did they do that? Well, Ellen, actually, you can tell which one she is because it's not the one with the beard, but they crossed what they said the boundaries of race, class, gender, and physical ability by passing as a white male planter, with William posing as her personal servant. So, servant, white master. So she was very light-skinned. Once they got into free territory, their escape was widely publicized because they had done it out in the open. The abolitionists brought them on tour to public lectures to gain support for abolition. But when they sometimes, such as in Boston, after the Fugitive Slave Act that I talked about, slave catchers went after them. So they left the United States and they went there for 2 decades to England. They raised their children there, they lectured there, they wrote a book, several books, and Ellen lived until 1891. William lived until 1900. They opened actually in the 1860s when they returned, 1868, when they returned to the United States. They opened an agricultural school in Georgia. They worked the school, they worked the farm until about 1890. So, you know, very, very interesting, but I found them interesting because they were above the Underground Railroad. Yes, they disguised themselves as a white gentleman and her servant, but they were still part of the Underground Railroad. If you would like, before I show you the last slide, which has nothing to do with some coming attractions, if you have any questions or comments, please unmute yourself. feel free to say anything you'd like, ask questions. I do have information. If you want me to send to you on anything, I will be glad to send it to you on what my sources were. I'm doing that. Well, if you're thinking of questions or anything you'd like to say or say anything like that, just as I said, unmute yourself.
Hey.
These are, go ahead.
Hey, Alan, how did they know where they wanted to go?
They had people who guided them. You had the conductors who actually would hand it off to the next conductor, So they didn't have probably, I want to go to Boonton, or I want to go to Groton, Connecticut, or anything like that. They first wanted to get away from slave states. And as they went along, they probably talked to people as to where are some of the best and safest places to live their lives, whether it be in the United States or as, the Caribbean or Mexico or Canada.
Okay. That hotel you showed in Boot, is that the one that's right by the river?
It may be. I'm not sure. It's on Main Street. So the Main Street's got to be in Boonton. It's got to be by the river. If you're on 287, it's probably you're traveling south.
No, it's north.
South. No, I'm okay. Yeah, be on your north side. Yeah, but it would be
get off the Main Street and go up the hill.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I haven't been there, but now that I've done this program, I'm thinking of going to many of these places now. Other questions or comments? Next Friday, we're leaving the area. We're going to Route 66. We're going to travel through 8 states. It's based partly on my research and partly on my trip in 2016 that I traveled Route 66. I did it backwards. Most people, if you even listen to this song, that's Get Your Kicks on Route 66, you start in Chicago and you wind up in Santa Monica. My friend and I did something backwards. We started in Santa Monica and went to Chicago, with stops along the way. And that's next Friday. And the drawing on the picture on the right-hand side is the part of the old Croton Aqueduct. Mario Medici, who has done programs for us on Ellis Island and Central Park, has a program he'll be doing that. I actually was up by that dam and everything last Saturday with my older daughter, and we were going to hike up the hill, but it was a little bit too much ice going up, even with walking poles. So we walked around and then we found another parking spot. And actually you can walk all the way across up here. And on the far side is the dam. There's a park on this side. So Mario's going to do, and the aqueduct stretches from up north into New York City. So he's going to do a program on Thursday, the 24th at 7 on that one. So his programs are always great. So I encourage you to be part of that. Any other questions or comments? I hope you found this interesting. We do have just one other thing. Well, we have a couple other things that don't have a slide. We have our crafts next Tuesday. It's Zoom. It's for adults. We're making taking tile and postcards and making coasters. And then later in the month for Black History Month, for our movie club, we're discussing the 1972 movie Sounder, which is really good. So any other questions, comments?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for this presentation.
Okay.
And do you think that you had said that not the participants, but the people in the Underground Railroad, either I guess the hosts or the volunteers, the ones that were sacrificing themselves, you said sometimes they went out into the water to travel north. Do they say if that's because it was easier, or maybe because there were maybe less laws out on the water in case they were caught?
I don't think it was easier. I think that it was, as long as you had a sympathetic captain like the man in the box who made it to Philadelphia, you could travel, number one, a further distance quicker, but you had less people after you on the waters, as I said, as long as you were on a ship with a sympathetic captain. So if you were the later routes, if you were going to the Caribbean, you would take a ship from Florida. You would take a ship from Georgia if you could get on it and not be caught and get out that way. You know, the people who escorted and guided the escaped slaves are also at peril, because if you were caught doing that, you're going to jail or worse for that also. So it's not the people go back to slavery if they're caught, the escaped slaves, but the people assisting them go to jail. And that's why when the federal government said you had to, they had to return, a lot of the states said, no, you can't make us do it. And they overruled it.
It would seem that viewers or people that were interested in your program or this fantastic idea, that they would like the program on Lincoln that's coming up on cable, which looks really good.
No, yeah, you can tie it in because you had in 1863 the Emancipation Proclamation. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, it really centers around that whole period when they're trying to pass that, and his ideas and Congress's ideas. So if you haven't seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, I recommend that because it does lay out what was going on during the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a lot of good stuff, as you said, on PBS on this subject. But if you look on YouTube or you just search Underground Railroad, do a Google search on Underground Railroad, you can find a lot of not only narratives, you can find a lot of videos, and even the New Jersey Historical Society. I got a pamphlet from them called Steal Away, Steal Away. It's a guide to the Underground Railroad in New Jersey. And it's available online. So the Historical Society has it. I mean, I'm gonna make plans once I leave the library, in the spring or something. I'm going down to Timbuktu. I want to see that cemetery, and I want to get look in the area and stuff like that. All righty then. Enjoy the nice weather tomorrow. I hear we're going to have before the cold comes back on Sunday. And if you like the Super Bowl, watch the Super Bowl. Watch the Puppy Bowl. I don't know. I just enjoy. I thank you for coming, as I always do. I look forward to seeing you next week if you'd like to go on Route 66. A lot of strange things on Route 66. And I hope you all stay well.
Thank you again, and happy
Thanks,
Valentine's Day.
Yep. Take you too.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Great job.